All right. Well, yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Really appreciate you being here. And especially thank you to J-Buff sent me who put together the presentation that we'll be going over. He's going to make the case that the New Testament predicts a second coming that didn't come. So it'll definitely be pretty exciting. He has posted some slides if you'd like to follow along in the speaker's whiteboard. So you can take a look there and kind of follow along with his presentation. If you're interested in any other events that we have coming up, at the top of the left panel, you'll see the events tab, and you'll see the events that we have coming. We have Nick. Nick is making the case for the existence of an immaterial world, so essentially against physicalism. And then we're going to see the book lord. He's making his case for the ontological argument, which should be very exciting after that. I am also starting to schedule events in June now that we're into May. And so if you'd like to make a case and kind of answer questions on it, it is a very casual format. It doesn't have to be anything super formal. I know Caleb set the bar pretty high for us a couple of weeks ago, much higher than I actually do myself when I'm presenting. So, but it doesn't have to be as crazy as that. If you just, it's coffee shop apologetics, and so it's meant to be just kind of like a conversation over coffee with friends. So, if you're interested in that, please do just send me a direct message, and I'd be happy to get something scheduled for you, and we'll go from there. So yeah, without further ado, thanks J-Buff for coming on. If you want to just go ahead and let us know why you think that the New Testament makes false predictions about the second coming.
Yeah, appreciate it. So yeah, I first want to obviously start off by thanking everyone for joining. Also want to thank Matt as well for just opening up the floor to, to people outside of Christians to really share and defend a position. And I believe, am I the first pretty much non-Christian to defend a position at this point?
So technically, so you're the first person that's actually made a case like against Christianity. We had Dr. Eric
Mm,
Wielenberg on a few weeks ago. I don't remember the exact date.
yeah.
He's an agnostic and he was making the case against the Kalam. So this will be the first case like
Okay.
directly against Christianity, but we have had an agnostic on before.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll go ahead and get right into it. Like Matt said, I'm not able to screen share on here, but I do have a presentation. So I would highly recommend following along with me on those slides because, unless you have a photographic memory of the whole New Testament, we're going to dig pretty deep into the scriptures. So you will get lost if you aren't following along. I posted that link in the speaker's whiteboard section, so feel free to click that. Um, but yeah, to get started, the title of my discussion today is The Second Coming That Never Came. I thought that had a nice ring to it. And moving on to slide two, the claim that I'll be defending today is that the Gospels predicted that Jesus' second coming would occur soon within the life of his followers. And this was ultimately a failed prediction because the second coming never came. Now, to begin, I first want to go through some passages in Scripture to figure out where does Jesus talk about this second coming, and what does he say about it. We know that throughout his ministry, the Gospels tell us that Jesus warned his contemporaries about a coming day of judgment, where he would return in the clouds, and on this day, every man would receive punishment or reward for their deeds. Moving on to slide three. So we see this most notably, I think, in Matthew 25, where we read about the parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus says this. He says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And the wicked will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." Slide four. So I want us to pay close attention to some of the key phrases that Jesus is using here, because we're going to see that there are actually a few common descriptive phrases that Jesus uses to describe his second coming in the Gospels. He consistently describes it as a day when the Son of Man will come in glory, or in the glory of his Father, the angels, and he will gather people together to punish the wicked and reward the righteous. And we can think of these as I like to call them signposts. So when we see these key descriptive phrases being used, we can know that Jesus is talking about his second coming. So I want us to move to the next slide. You'll notice that all those elements do appear in Matthew 25. So it says, when the Son of Man comes in glory, you see where it mentions that the angels will be with him. It even mentions the gathering of the nations before him, and then the mention of the wicked and the righteous receiving their respective punishment and reward. Now, I want to show that we do see these themes used consistently together throughout the Gospels. So, I want us to do like sort of an exhaustive study of all the other times that that language is used. So, if you go to the next slide, as it turns out, there are three other instances where we find some of these exact motifs. So, we'll start with Matthew 13. It says, "So will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father." So you'll notice how this passage, it has all the elements that we mentioned before, and the only thing that's not mentioned here is that the Son of Man will come in glory, quote unquote. But I think that's a fair assumption to make, that if the Son of Man is coming, he's probably coming in glory. So I take this still to be a reference to the second coming. Next, moving on to slide 7, we have Matthew 16, which is a very concise version of this. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has." Again, everything is mentioned here, with the exception of the gathering, but all the major elements are here. So it seems fair to say that we're still talking about the same event. Slide 8, then we have Matthew 24, which is sort of an infamous text with regard to this topic. It says, "They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." And then a bit later in the chapter, in verse 45 through 51, Jesus does tell a parable where he indicates that when he returns, the faithful servants, as he calls them, will be rewarded, while the wicked servants will be cut into pieces. I couldn't fit those verses on the slide, but this is a reference to the punishing of the wicked and the rewarding of the righteous. So again, all the elements are there. We can conclude from all these passages then that throughout the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly warned of a day of reckoning, and we can know when he's talking about this event because there are signposts in the text. There are these phrases and these themes that are used repeatedly. Now, I want to quickly point out that sometimes the mistake is made where some people interpret this event to be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE. They believe that all this talk of the Son of Man coming to judge the world is just apocalyptic language to depict God coming in judgment against Jerusalem, very similar to the kind of language that we find in the Old Testament prophets. Now, while I do believe that the destruction of Jerusalem is related to this event, I don't think it's synonymous. And here's why, if you move to slide 9. In the passages that we looked at, if you read the surrounding verses, Jesus talks about this as an event that would be global in scale. So in Luke 21, which is just a retelling of Matthew 24, Jesus' day will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. So I don't think he gets much clearer than that. And then in Matthew 25, he says that on this day, Jesus will gather all the nations before him to be judged. Now, that certainly doesn't sound like a local event. And furthermore, in that same chapter, Matthew also says that the wicked will go away into eternal punishment, and the righteous into eternal life. So it's hard to see how the destruction in 70 CE can accommodate that kind of strong language. So I think we're dealing with a much more global event here, something that has eternal significance and not just a localized tragedy that we're 2,000 years removed from. It seems like what we're talking about is what many Christians refer to as the parousia, or the second coming of Christ, which is understood to be a worldwide event. Now, getting into the meat of the argument, what does Jesus say about when this second coming would occur? Well, if we go back to the passages we referenced earlier, we can try to see if there's anything that's said about the timing. I can let you know already that Matthew 25 does not mention anything about timing. Matthew 13 says that it's going to take place at the end of the age, but he doesn't tell us when the end of the age will be. So not too helpful for us. But moving on to slide 10, the Matthew 16 passage, however, it does give us some possible references to time. So, reading Matthew 16 again, says, "For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now, again, we already established that verse 27 is about the second coming. It has all the signposts that we had mentioned earlier. The Son of Man coming with the angels in glory to dish out punishment and reward. So we know the context is, and in the very next verse, he reassures his apostles that some of them would not die before they witnessed that event. Now, there have been a number of interpretive strategies that Christians have used to suggest that the phrase Son of Man coming in his kingdom in verse 28 doesn't mean what we think it means. And maybe we'll get into some of that after this talk, perhaps. But suffice it to say for now that on its face, at least, it certainly seems like Jesus is speaking about his second coming here, given the preceding verse. And he appears to be giving his disciples some inkling of when that would occur. Moving on to slide 11. So what about the next passage that we discussed, Matthew 24, indicators of timing there? Well, yes, in fact, this is probably the clearest chapter that we have on the subject. In so many words, Jesus tells his disciples that the Jerusalem temple would be destroyed, which did occur in 70 CE, and that this would usher in a period of great suffering, and that immediately after that period of suffering, in the aftermath of the destruction, there would be signs in the heavens, and then the Son of Man would come in glory and send angels to gather his people. So here, Matthew 24 actually gives us a timeline of events where Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 CE. That leads to a period of suffering for the Jews. And then immediately after that suffering, Christ would return. So far, we have two potential indications in the Gospels that the second coming would take place soon in the apostles' lifetime. Matthew 13 says that some of them would be alive to witness it, and Matthew 24 says that it would take place in the immediate aftermath of the temple's destruction. Slide 12. And a few verses later in Matthew 24, he gives us even more information about that timing. He says, "When you see all these things, know that he is near at the very door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. But about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." So in these verses, there's some specificity mixed with a little bit of ambiguity here. So it's ambiguous in the fact that the precise moment of Jesus' coming is said to be unknown, even to Jesus himself. But in spite of that ambiguity, we still have another clear statement from Jesus that seems to indicate an imminent return. Regardless of when that precise moment would be, Jesus does reassure them that it would take place in their generation, in the generation of those living at the time. So again, this seems to agree with the other passages that we've already come across that the second coming would take place while the people at the time were still living. So now we have at least three indications of this in the Gospels that all seem to agree with one another. There's also another passage that we haven't looked at that could be a reference to the second coming, where Jesus might be saying something about the timing. If you move to slide 13, he says to his apostles in Matthew 10, "Truly I tell you, you will not have finished going through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." So we have that language again of Son of Man coming. And Jesus appears to be saying that the second coming would occur before the apostles even got to finish their missionary work. If that's true, then that would be further indication of imminence. But as you can see, when you compare it to the signposts that we mentioned on the left side of the screen, there aren't any other descriptors in the text about angels or a gathering or a judgment of the wicked or anything like that. So although this could be a reference to the second coming, we won't include it because it's lacking in too much detail. But moving on to slide 14, needless to say, everywhere we look, when we want to find out when will this event take place, the passages all seem to unanimously point to a time that is imminent and within the apostles' lifetime. And the more sayings you have about an event that seem to be saying the same thing about it, the more likely it is that they are saying the same thing. So if you want to say that these verses are actually saying different things from one another, and that the plain text reading is wrong, then you better have some strong reasons for thinking so. Now, I could stop there, and I think we'd already have a good solid case for thinking that the Gospels predicted an imminent second coming. But we also have the testimony of the early Christians themselves who talk about this. So in First Corinthians, for example, Paul is writing to members of the church in Corinth, and he gives them a list of recommendations about marriage of all topics. Even though Paul himself wasn't married, but he suggests that if you're a virgin man, you shouldn't try to look for a wife, and if you're already married, you shouldn't try to get a divorce. Why? Why does he say this? Because for Paul, the world is about to pass away, right? So going to slide 15, for him, the time is short, the end is near. You don't have time to be worrying about marrying the right person or trying to settle down with someone. I mean, think about it for yourself. How many of you, if you knew that the world was about to end, would be concerned about looking for a wife or trying to get a divorce? For Paul, those things aren't as important. Your focus needs to be on serving God. So he says this in 1 Corinthians 7. He says, "Are you committed to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you free of commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. But those who marry will face troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I'm saying, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. For this world in its present form is passing away. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but in order to promote proper decorum and undivided devotion to the Lord." So it appears Paul believed that he was living in a time when things were wrapping up, and God was about to bring this world to a close. And as a result, the believer should live as if he has no earthly commitments and instead devote himself fully to the gospel. Moving to slide 16, here's another passage in the Epistle of James. We have James saying, "Be patient, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain against one another, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door." Now, you might recall that Jesus said back in Matthew 24 that when you see all these things, when you see all the signs, then you will know that he is near, that my coming is near, even at the door. James is picking up on that language here, and he's saying that he himself is sort of living in that time when things are near and the judge is at the door. So that's what we see here. In the next slide, finally, we have a few other verses here. Romans 13:12, Paul says, "The night is nearly over, the day is almost here." And that night versus day language is an expression that Paul uses to describe the present evil age versus the age to come when Christ would return. So, as far as Paul was concerned, this present evil age was nearly over, and that future age of glory was soon approaching. Then you have 1 Peter 4:7, where it says, "The end of all things is near." 1 John 2:18, "Dear children, this is the last hour." And I could go on this train of thought for quite a while. There are plenty of verses in the New Testament like this that I could display. But you can see that there's a clear pattern that emerges here. The earliest followers of Christ expected an imminent end. And we can only imagine where they must have gotten this notion from. I mean, if we consider these texts, along with all the other passages in the Gospels that I just read of Jesus reassuring his apostles that the event would take place in their lifetime, then we have a very consistent and coherent picture. Um, so moving on to slide 18. Furthermore, it's not just me that's saying these things. This view that the Gospels predicted an imminent climax to history within the lifetime of the apostles is a view that is so well supported that it has managed to convince a majority of New Testament scholars, both Christian and non-Christian alike, for nearly a century. So I feel like that's super important to note that this is not some view that's unique to me. The majority of scholars also support this view. And lastly, to sort of wrap up, I wanted to wrap up by quoting the words of arguably the most eloquent and renowned Christian scholar of the 20th century, and that's C.S. Lewis. He was a beautiful writer, and I still to this day, even though I'm not a believer, I'm an atheist, agnostic, but I still regard his work as some of the greatest pieces of literature that's ever been written. And this is what he says in his essay, "The World's Last Night." He says, "Say what you like, we shall be told. The apocalyptic beliefs of the first Christians have been proved to be false. It is clear from the New Testament that they all expected the second coming in their own lifetime. And worse still, they had a reason, and one which you will find very embarrassing. Their master had told them so. He said in so many words, 'This generation shall not pass till all these things be done.' And he was wrong. He clearly knew no more about the end of the world than anything else. It is certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible, yet how teasing also that within 14 words of it should come the statement, 'But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father.' The one exhibition of error and the one confession of ignorance grow side by side." I love that quote by C.S. Lewis, and one thing I always loved about him is that he was intellectually honest enough to accept even the most embarrassing aspects of his faith, and not try to turn a blind eye to them, or try to force them into an apologetic. C.S. Lewis, he really showed people how to sit in that discomfort, and that you don't need to abandon your faith over a couple of difficult passages. So, for C.S. Lewis, his solution to this was that Jesus was just as much a man as he was God. So he was a first century, mostly uneducated Jew from the backwoods of Galilee. So we shouldn't be surprised that, like most first century uneducated Jews, he believed in a soon coming apocalypse. And I think that's a perfectly coherent Christian response. There are ways, I want to make that very clear, there are ways to reconcile this with the Christian faith. So this argument that I'm making is not meant to be a defeater for Christianity per se. In fact, when I was a believer, my view was that the disciples must have misunderstood Jesus somewhere because it was very difficult for me to. So that was my view, and it makes sense. I mean, when you read the Gospels, the disciples were always misunderstanding Jesus. So even that seems like a natural Christian response to me. But I will say, and I'll end with this, I will say that if one wants to say that the Gospels are infallible in the sense that Scripture is true in all that it teaches, then I think that this argument definitely puts a gaping hole in that. So yeah, I will end on that note. I'm sure there's going to be some questions, some objections, so I can go ahead and open up the floor for that now.
Perfect. Thanks so much, J Buff. So yeah, first we got Jonathan on the side. Sorry, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. If you do want to get in the queue to interact with J Buff, whether it's a question or objection or what have you, you can press the hand icon at the bottom of your page of your screen. It's got a little page with three lines on it. If you click on that, that'll put you in the queue, and then when I send you an invite, you'll see another button at the top of your screen that you hit in order to accept my invite and come on stage. So I'll go ahead and send the invite over to Jonathan now. Hey Jonathan, how you doing?
Oh, doing all right. How are you?
Doing well.
Hey,
Doing well. What's
Jonathan.
on your mind?
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Java, for your presentation. And I feel like your comments at the last point here kind of took the novelty out of this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I'm just curious how significant you think this argument is. Like, who should be bothered by it? How much should
Mm,
they adjust their views in response to it? So here's a story that someone could tell, and I'm curious how you evaluate this. So let's say someone says this in response to your argument. So we
mhm,
know that early Christians were apocalyptic in their outlook. They weren't alone in this. Lots of apocalyptic sects in the first century Roman Empire. So perhaps this apocalypticism that they all had in their community, in their groups, was just read back into the sayings of Jesus, say by Mark in his role as a creative biographer. So that might have been within the range of acceptable literary practices. So then, even if this imminent expectation motif then reflects the author's opinions, do we have to say that it reflects those of Jesus as well? And if we say
mm,
that it doesn't reflect the opinions of Jesus, is that somehow less problematic or equally problematic and just in different ways? I guess my sense is that it's probably less problematic to think that Paul and maybe the gospel authors who were potentially influenced by him held these apocalyptic expectations, and then that this was kind of read back in to the language of Jesus. Maybe words were put on his lips, that sort of thing. So I guess in summary, I'm asking, do you think that this argument you're offering is just sort of an internal critique, i.e., like, I can't accept both a robust theory of inspiration and this interpretation of these passages? Or do you think that we have good reason to accept that Jesus said these things, was clear about the timing of the end times coming? So, like, presumably you, as an atheist, think that the Gospels report things that didn't happen. So is this just one of those cases? Should we not be bothered by it?
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal question, and yeah, you definitely hit on the answer to that, which is I do present this as just sort of an internal critique. So I do think it would be, of course, less problematic if Jesus himself did not say these words, and these were just sort of kind of put on his lips. You'll notice that throughout my presentation, I didn't make any specific claims about what the historical Jesus actually said and did and all those things. I try to keep it very specific to what the Gospels were predicting and what the Gospels themselves say about what Jesus said. And I will caveat by saying that I do believe there was a historical Jesus. I'm not a mythicist or anything like that, and I do believe that the Gospels do give us information about this Jesus, and there's things that we can glean from them about what Jesus was like, some of the things he taught, some of the things he did. But it gets, as many scholars and historians will know, it gets really difficult once you start getting down to it of which things did he say and did not say. So myself personally, if you're asking for my own personal opinion, I don't have an opinion on whether or not Jesus specifically predicted whether it's the destruction of Jerusalem. I'm more inclined to think that he probably didn't predict the second coming, mostly because I don't think that he was divine or saw himself as someone who would raise from the dead and then would need to come back again later. But yeah, so this is more of an internal critique. So I'll say this: that if you are a Christian who does believe in the infallibility of Scripture, for example, then like I said, that would be a problem because then you'd be saying that Scripture, if you're agreeing with the arguments at least, you're saying that Scripture is teaching this imminent coming that we know did not happen yet. So that would be my reply to that.
Cool. Thanks so much. And I agree pretty much with what you said, and I'd just be curious for the Christians in the queue coming in with their own questions if they'd be comfortable adopting that interpretation. It sounds like when you were a Christian, you also had this kind of interpretation that I'm putting forward. So I'd be
Yes.
curious to know if other people share that intuition as well. But thanks for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan.
Hello? I'm doing well. I need to change my audio output. Okay, can you all hear me?
I hear you.
Great. Well, thanks for that presentation. I thought that was wonderful, and I especially appreciate your comments at the end, how charitable you were to us Christians. So thank you for that. There's a lot I could ask just because I've been doing a lot of reading on this issue for the past 4 months or so.
Yeah.
But I'll just limit my question to one. What do you make of the conditional prophecy view? So this is a view that's been defended by Christopher Hayes in a recent book called "When the Son of Man Didn't Come."
Hmm.
And Hayes argues, along with some other scholars, that Jesus, you know, falling in line with the with prior Jewish and later Christian tradition, gave a prophecy of judgment, but intended it as a conditional prophecy. And so, if Jesus said, "This generation shall not pass away until the Parousia happens," that doesn't happen. That's not a problem for Christian theology because that's not really falsified.
Interesting. Yeah. I have to confess, I'm not familiar with this view of the specific view of conditional prophecy. I am familiar with the idea of conditional prophecy, and I'd be very curious to hear what the argument is specifically, like where in the text, with the person say that Jesus indicated that the prophecy is conditional, because I do see that that Jesus, obviously he makes statements like, truly I say unto you, verily, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass until these things are fulfilled. Which when he makes those kind of statements of verily I say unto you, typically I tend to ascribe to those kind of statements more, I guess, more force, less, for conditions to be added there. It sounds like this is something that's for sure going to happen. So yeah, I'd be curious what is the argument in terms of that? Like, where do they
Yeah.
place it in the text that there is some conditional prophecy here?
Yeah. Well, before I address that, I just want to say I agree with you that I guess like the double amen sayings do suggest like that Jesus is saying something that is not really conditional or contingent, especially because in the Greek of Mark 13:30 you've got ouphe, which is the strongest Greek negation you can have. This generation will certainly not pass away. So I agree that the conditional prophecy won't work for that passage. But then I would give an independent argument to think that that's not referring to the perusing material in verses 24 through 27. Um, anyway, so the Hayes argues in his book that one, there's a very strong prior probability that Jesus would make a conditional prophecy because this is the way the Old Testament prophets conceived of prophecy. This is the way a lot of prophecy appears in intertestamental literature and later rabbinic literature, and also this is the way a lot of later Christians, even New Testament authors, conceived of prophecy. Um, Not limited to like Second Peter 3, but also in like the early tradition of Acts 3, where Peter says that Israel needs to repent so that the times of refreshing come about. As for Jesus's specific view, you have something like in Matthew 23, where Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem, and Jesus says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And then within the Olivet discourse specifically, you've got a passage like Mark 13, I think it's verse 14, where Jesus says, "Pray in order that." So it won't happen in winter or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but that Greek word hina, suggests that there's a causal connection between the prayer and the timing of the actual Perusia.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, you mentioned a couple things there. You mentioned the probability, that you can kind of glean from the fact that the Old Testament prophets and um, that they used it, and it's also in intertestamental literature. I think all that is fine. I think for sure we know that the Old Testament prophets, absolutely did sometimes use conditional prophecy. So I would have no problem with that. As for this, however, I guess the two things that you mentioned, for example, um, the verse that says, pray that it won't happen in winter and things like that. Um, I guess with that, it's hard to see that as this will not happen, or sorry, not this won't happen, but rather there's a possibility that this won't happen. It sounds like in the statement, like pray that this won't happen in winter or during the Sabbath, or that you won't be pregnant during that time. It just sounds like all of these things are, Jesus is communicating that he does have some level of ignorance about when this would come, which we know that he himself said those things. He said that the Son of Man does not know when this will be. So it makes perfect sense to me that he would say, pray that this won't happen in the winter or some other time. So I'm not sure how that would be conditional. As for Matthew 23, though, I take your point. I do think that that's it's certainly possible to interpret it that way. That's not exactly how I interpret that passage. I mean, I think that there's a way to read that such that what Jesus is saying is not, I'm not coming back until you welcome me with open arms, or I won't be back in this period unless you welcome me. I could also hear him saying something of the sort of, the next time that you see me, I'll be coming to you in glory, and you'll actually be saying, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." So because this man that you once tried to kill will be now coming back in glory, and you will have no other choice but to acknowledge my glory in that moment. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's another way that could be understood. But yeah, I definitely take your point. If there is any conditional aspect to this prophecy, it would have to be Matthew 23, because I don't see it anywhere else.
So I'll just say one quick thing before I hand it off to somebody else. Yeah, I think those are good responses. Um, the so as for the specific interpretation of Matthew 23, why I take that to be conditional and not the view you offered, I would just Dale Allison has a really good paper on this. He wrote it back in the 80s. And I can't remember all the arguments right now, so I just kind of relate you to that.
Sure.
And yeah, of course, Matthew 13, 14 by itself is extremely weak. But I would just use it as kind of like the cherry on the top, part of a larger cumulative case, and especially emphasize the function of that word hina, in order that, as if there's a causal. Well, let me put it this way: as if how his disciples pray will actually affect how the Son of Man comes in glory. So yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, yeah, I'll let you have the last word on that. But yeah, thank you, Bram. I'll go ahead and also check out. You said it was Dale Allison's work on that Matthew 23 conditional prophecy. Is that right?
Yeah, it's called yeah, I think it's just called Matthew 23, 35b, and then Luke 11 something, 35. Yeah, Luke so it's Matthew 23, 35 and Luke 11, 35 as a conditional prophecy by Dale Allison. And it's an older paper.
Bram, does he
Awesome,
All
man.
give?
right.
Well, yeah.
I'm not terribly familiar with the book myself. Does he give any like criteria for identifying a conditional prophecy and tell the difference between a prophecy that hey this will happen and a conditional one that well this might happen?
Yeah, he does. Not Dale Allison, because I was just Dale Allison is just the guy who wrote the paper on Matthew 23. But Christopher Hayes in his book, When the Son of Man Didn't Come, yeah, the first 5 chapters of that book I think are really good, extensive, detailed. Yeah.
Okay, because the reason why I asked that is I have heard of conditional prophecy before, and it seems that Jonah's prophecy to Nineveh is such a conditional prophecy where he says you have 40 days and you'll be destroyed. Laziest sermon in the history of sermons. But that he says that, and the reason why they aren't destroyed in 40 days is because they repent. And I think that
Hmm.
the one criteria that we would identify in that case is that it's conditional because like there's sort of an implication on them receiving the prophecy that there's something they can do about it, namely
Yeah.
repent. And so
Well,
it seems like conditional prophecies would have some sort of effect that they intend to garner in their audience, whereas Matthew 24 is spoken to the disciples. It's not for them to repent; they have repented, and it's written to the church, which it's not that they need to accept Christ; they have accepted Christ. And so I'm not sure if that sort of thing, or how would if do you see
how
like
to?
the
Yeah.
disparity that I'm making? Like how would you fit
Yeah. Yeah.
24
Well,
into that?
I would just disagree that that there's no like connection with moral exhortation in the Olivet Discourse, because in Mark 13 and Matthew 24, and the Lucan version of as well, you have this exhortation to stay awake, to not grow idle, that kind of thing. And I think you also have that throughout the rest of the New Testament as well, which is why so many times when the New Testament authors say that the Son of Man is near, or the Parousia is near, um, immediately follows is an exhortation to not live in slumber, and be a good person. And I think there are indications elsewhere in the New Testament that good moral behavior can actually hasten the Parousia, and uh, bad moral behavior can slow it down.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, thanks so much. I'll go ahead and
Yeah.
put you back in the audience and send an invite out to Caleb. Once again, if Caleb's the only one in the queue right now, if you do want to make a comment or have an interaction with JBuff, just hit that icon, the hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be able to pull you up on stage. Hey Caleb, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you for asking. Oh, good, my mic actually works this time.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, I know we had issues last time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was a good presentation, Jay Buff. I had two kind of brief questions, and these aren't really things that I have an opinion on. I'm just kind of curious with that. So when I read the Olivet discourses, it seems to me the most natural reading is that it's referring to one event, right? Like as if Jerusalem, the temple will be destroyed and then the end will come and all that. Like some people will say, well, at this verse, it's meant to be, oh, now he's talking about a further, like he means, oh, this will happen in this generation, but then the stuff later on happens way longer down. I don't think, granted, I know I'm reading it in the English and I don't know the Greek, but it seems to me that's all referring to one event. So I think that might help your case. But the strange thing is, and I'm going to presume that you would take the view that most scholars do, that the Gospels are probably post 70. So I'm wondering if that's the case. Why did Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? Well, I don't think John mentions it as much, but if they are writing after the temple's fall, if Jesus originally said that the end would come and the temple would be destroyed and all that would happen at once, then why don't the gospel authors make that more clear if they're writing after the temple's fallen? Because clearly they know at this point, well, obviously Jesus didn't come back at that moment in time, but maybe he's going to come back still in a few more years. So do you think that the gospel authors would retroactively try to make that distinction more clear for apologetic reasons, to show, oh no, wait, guys, he actually, because we see this with like Jehovah's Witnesses when they try to reinterpret things when they don't come into being. So it
Yeah.
seems weird that they don't seem to be doing that, and they seem to kind of just like admit that, yeah, that's what he originally said. We're not going to try to go over and make additions to make it more obvious that he means this is further out. So I didn't know if that you had comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, in my own personal interpretation, it doesn't seem to me that the gospel writers were imagining that Jesus would return in the clouds as the destruction was happening. It definitely seems like it's something that they expected would take some time after the destruction before things start happening, in terms of Jesus' second coming. And the reason I believe that is based actually on Luke 21. So Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, which ironically you were talking about how
Mm-hmm.
you would expect that there would be this development over time of kind of them pulling back off of the imminence of this coming, and you do see some of that in Luke, where Luke, as opposed to Matthew and Mark, does go into more detail about what would be happening during that time of tribulation for Israel. And instead of just sort of centering around purely just the destruction of Jerusalem, he also says, and I'm reading Luke 21, verse 23 through, 24. Basically, he says, there should be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So we know that at least for Luke, who according to most scholars, is writing later than the other synoptics,
Mm-hmm.
he does include this extra information about, oh yeah, not only will they, not only will the temple be destroyed and all that, but there's also going to be, they're going to fall by the edge of the sword. They're going to be led away captive. It's not as if Jesus comes on the clouds and then saves everybody from this destruction. There's going to be a period of time in between then. So then, yeah, and there's other things I could say about that. I don't want to go on for too long, but essentially, yes, that's my view. Is that these people, these gospel writers, if they are writing after 70 CE, are likely expecting several years or so before the coming of the Son of Man. So that's how I would
Yeah,
respond to that.
yeah, I have heard people say that about Luke as well. So I think multiple scholars have taken that view as well. So that's a good point. Well, as a follow-up to that, I know I'm cheating a little bit here, but we only have
Sure.
one other hand raised, so I don't think Matt will care that much. Do you think that just because you mentioned coming on the yeah, just because you mentioned the coming on the clouds imagery, do you think that has any connection to the fall of Jerusalem, where I believe it's Josephus and Tacitus mention, among other things, that there were soldiers seen in the clouds and that they were surrounding Jerusalem. And I don't know if I mean, this is probably was, I'm assuming Mark was probably written before Jewish war was, and I think Paul uses similar imagery in First Thessalonians, if I'm not mistaken, about
Mhm.
angels in the clouds doing that. So do you think there is some kind of connection here, whether literally happening or like a literary one, or what do you
Do,
make
do
of
you
that?
mean Do you mean in terms of actual fulfillment, or do you mean in terms of someone writing after the fact, having witnessed those things, would have, retroactively put that in the text?
It could be either of those. Although again, I'm saying I think at least we can be pretty sure that Paul and Mark are writing before Josephus did.
Yeah.
So I,
Hmm.
I think it would be, is there is it like, could it be the case that these things happen to match up, and could, I've heard Christians appeal to that, and what do we make of that? Or is it just a coincidence? Or is this like a common Jewish literary motif to say, like the Son of Man or Yahweh's on the clouds? Like, is that just a common thing in Judaism to do?
Yeah, I mean, when I read passages in the Old Testament, and forgive me, it's slipping my mind where exactly it's found in the Old Testament. I could get those verses for you, but I know that there are allusions to, God Himself actually coming on the clouds as well,
Mhm.
sort of in judgment. So, given that we have those references so far back, I would be skeptical of the idea that these things were retroactively put into the text. And then I would also agree with you, though, that obviously we see Paul using it, and Josephus using it. So I think that when it comes to those signs that were sort of happening in the heavens and stuff like that, I think that you might have a reference to that in Luke, because Luke talks about there being signs in the heavens. I mean, all of the Olivet discourses in each of those gospels talk about there being signs. But Luke seems to be Luke repeats that sort of language twice, which kind of gives me the idea that he has seen something. That there's some things going on in the heavens, that's strange to people, and kind of eliciting this idea of, oh yeah, maybe these are the signs that Jesus was talking about. So
Yeah, I
so
think that's
yeah.
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I did my presentation on miracles, and regardless of how one feels about that, my kind of point is that one doesn't need to dismiss stuff in history necessarily as legendary. There could be a basis that's based on. So I do think Josephus, when he writes that, he just says, "Well, people say this, and it's incredible, but I'm only recording because a lot of people told me this." I have no reason to think that people didn't sincerely believe that they saw this in the clouds. That whether this was, people still see weird stuff in the clouds today. Just look at UFOs. So
Yeah.
I have no
Hmm.
reason to doubt that the ancient world was just as weird, and that there were weird things people
Yeah.
were supernatural events. So I don't dismiss that as, oh, people were just making stories up. Like maybe there was something that started that. But the last thing I was going to ask, actually, this kind of goes into what you were saying about like looking for signs, is when people talk about the resurrection, a lot of the times it's like, well, I don't know if you've read N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, about 20 years ago, I believe it was written. But he's famous for the argument that it's strange that Christians believe Jesus was raised from the dead because they didn't believe that this was supposed to happen until the end of time, right? And so people say, well, they had this apocalyptic expectation, and so they moved, instead of the resurrection being an event at everyone at once at the end of time, it was now sequential to say, okay, now we're in the end times, and Jesus is the first fruits, while Paul calls it, and we're going to follow soon after, right? So that seems to be how the Christians shifted that epistemology. But then it's weird to me to think that why didn't Christians with this apocalyptic expectation say, well, other people are being raised too. Like when I read 1 Peter 1:8, when he says, well, you have not seen Jesus, but you still love him. Like, why not say, oh, so and so has had visions of the resurrected Peter after he was martyred? Like, I feel like this would be better apocalyptic evidence to say, Jesus was the first because he was the Messiah, but look, all these other people are resurrecting. We've had visions of them. So this is evidence that we are in the end times. And so I feel like if Christians really held on to that view that they were in the end times, they would try to cling to this and look for further evidence of that. And it's really weird to me that they don't do that. They don't try to appeal to other people being resurrected as further proof that we are in the end times to convince the skeptics, right? So do you have like any thoughts on that as to why they didn't necessarily go that route, or maybe they did? I don't know.
I mean, I would say that first of all, we only have obviously a few writings from the ancient world, so obviously it's very possible that there is, that there were some allusions being made to this, whether in writing or in some sort of oral traditions as well. But I don't know if I would say that I would necessarily expect that, and I guess the reason being that, I mean, obviously, if you look even outside of the New Testament, it's not as if resurrections weren't happening prior to that, at least according to records, right? We have the stories of Elijah and Elisha, raising the dead and stuff like that. Obviously, Lazarus was also risen from the dead. I don't know if
Well,
Spot
so just to
of
clarify, I mean
okay.
eschatological resurrection, like in an immortal body at the end of time. Because I mean, Jews did believe people could be raised, but I think you and I would agree when Paul's talking about Jesus being raised and saying we will be too, he means that kind. He means that end times. He doesn't mean we're going to be raised like Lazarus in a body. I think he has in mind this glorified body that is talked about in Maccabees and First Enoch and Second Baruch and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think there's a categorical difference there.
Right, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying that that there were resurrections, and I may have completely missed this. So yeah, definitely please correct me. It sounded like you were saying that there were reports of resurrections happening at that time, and why didn't the Christians use those resurrections as further evidence of this eschatological general resurrection that was soon to come? Is that what you were saying?
Well, I don't know if I would say there were reports. I think I would like if that was their mindset and they're looking around for proof. Like it's kind of, I think of it like Jehovah's Witnesses where they're like, "Oh, everything is COVID, Russia, all of this is proof the world's coming to an end," right? I'm kind of looking, well, oh, Jesus was raised, well, everyone's going to be raised really soon, guys, we're in the end times. And Paul does mention people having visions of and stuff like that in very charismatic environments, and we see this even with Pentecostals today. I'm just saying it's just if they're going to connect that to the resurrection, it's just weird that they don't run with it, like that they say, well, no,
Mm,
Jesus was the only one. And no, of course, actually, I think in Second Timothy, I know people don't think Paul wrote the pastorals. I believe it's in First, Second Timothy. Paul actually says he names two people who says the resurrection has already occurred, and then he condemns them. He says, but that's not true, and that's wrong. And so
mhm.
it's like, well, why wouldn't they say that? Like, why wouldn't they advocate that? I feel like that would just help their case. So, because if someone's like, well, I haven't seen Jesus raised, it's like, yeah, but look, people are still being resurrected today. That's proof that Jesus was raised. Paul makes that connection in First Corinthians, but he doesn't say other people have been resurrected. So it's just like I'm just trying to put myself in their mindset back then. I know that's hard to do historically, but like, what were they thinking, and why didn't they go this route, and how to do that? So maybe it's just hard to put ourselves and try to rationalize how they were rationalizing this in the first century.
All right,
Yeah,
we'll go ahead and
yeah,
let
yeah.
J-Buff
Okay.
respond, and then after that, we'll go to job
Yeah,
apologetics.
sounds good.
So thanks, Caleb.
Yeah. So just in response to that, I would say I think that's a good point. I will say, like I said it before, I don't know that the Christians didn't say that, and we really don't know whether they said that or not. I will say I would say probably the closest thing that we get to something like that is actually in the words of Jesus, where you have the disciples of John coming to Jesus, being sent from John and asking him, are you the one who is to come? And Jesus, basically responds and tells them, well, look around you. The dead are being raised. The blind are seeing. The deaf are hearing. The kingdom of God is coming. The kingdom of God is near at hand. So these are the proofs of that. I think that's probably the closest reference we get to something like associating resurrection with the coming kingdom of God. These resurrections that were happening during that time. But yeah, like I said, I don't know that the Christians didn't say that, and regardless of that fact, I don't know if that to me would constitute a strong reason to think that that Christians weren't thinking that they were living in apocalyptic times. So that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah, and to be fair, as I was listening to that, it sounds almost like we're saying, what if we someday have evidence, or what if there's evidence that we don't have that saves the conclusion that I want. And so it seems like in defense of J-Buck, it seems like it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, I'm going to base off the evidence we have, and if we get reports of that, then maybe we revise things. But for now, we don't have reports of that, and so we don't have to factor that possibility into our calculation until there's evidence for it. Does that sound reasonable, J-Buff, or maybe I
Yeah,
misunderstood the
yeah,
interaction?
yeah. Mhm.
Perfect. All right. Well, let me send an invite over to either Job Apologetics or Job Apologetics.
It's Job.
Job. Okay. Well, hey, thanks, Job, for coming on. What's on your mind?
Mhm. First of all, thank you for this presentation. This is very well done. It was very thought provoking.
Thank you.
Um, are you familiar with Adam Wynn and Stephen Forrest's interpretation of Hey Genea in Mark 13:30 and I think it's Matthew 24?
I'm not actually, no.
So it's been a while since I read the paper, so I don't think I can go into much detail. Basically, they argue that Ganea should be interpreted not as like a time span of like 30 to 40 years, but as in like eschatological generation of wickedness. So basically, Jesus is talking about these things will not happen until this part of this generation of wickedness is passes away, and he's not necessarily referring to um a period of time.
Mhm.
So what would you
Yeah,
say to that?
yeah, yeah. No, I haven't read the work itself, but I have heard of that sort of interpretation where uh, I've heard it in the reverse, where it's like the generation of like this generation refers to like the generation of the faithful as opposed to like the
Yeah.
generation of the wicked. Um, but yeah, to that, I guess I would say that we'd have to look at the text and sort of ask ourselves which definition of generation makes better sense of the context, right? So does the context to be understood, with regard to the spiritual state of the time period, or the spiritual state of people in general, or should it be understood temporally? So about time, and the immediate context in the surrounding verses, at least, seem to be about time, right? Jesus is talking about. The parable of the fig tree. When you see the trees start to sprout leaves, then you'll know that summer is near, right? And when you see these things, you'll know that, I'm about to come. So he's given these when statements and given indications of when something's near. And then even if you look in the larger context, if we expand out and ask ourselves, what is the chapter about, right? The disciples are asking me, right? They're asking, when will these things be? And it seems that Jesus has given them actually a direct answer. They say, when will these things be? Jesus responds, these things will be fulfilled in this generation, right? So it sounds like a natural flow, if we understand this temporally. So I think both the immediate context and the larger context kind of favors that temporal reading. And then we also have Jesus actually in the chapter directly preceding this one in Matthew 23, where Jesus says that God was going to come in judgment on the Jewish people and on their city. And he says again, he repeats that phrase, all this will come upon this generation. And in that case, everyone, scholars, lay people that are just reading the text, everyone agrees that that is an unambiguous reference to the people that were living in that time. So the actual generation, right? Um, so I guess I would say that I don't see any reason to interpret this word generation in sort of like this, the sense of like a spiritual state, aside from the fact that you can. I mean, I suppose that's a possible interpretation, and you can do that, but of course, can doesn't equal you should, right? We have to look
Yes.
at the text and look at the context and determine how, um, what best makes sense of the surrounding context. So,
Okay. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, as long as there's nobody else in the queue, maybe I can just kind of bounce the way I've read Matthew 24 off you, and just let me know why you think that would be a reasonable interpretation. Um, and so if you look at Matthew 24,
Not sure if there's anyone else. I
oh,
didn't see any hands in the queue. So,
I was still muted. I don't.
okay,
That's
sorry.
like the thing, like right, like since COVID. Oops, you're on mute.
Yeah,
So sorry about that. So yeah, as long as there's nobody else in the queue, maybe if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and bounce my interpretation of Matthew 24 off you and just see if you think that's
yeah,
plausible, if you think that's unreasonable, um, and whatnot. So for me, I look at Matthew 24, and it seems like Jesus is asked two questions, and he gives two answers. So immediately before that interaction, he gives a prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem, specifically not even the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple. And he says, look at these beautiful buildings, and Jesus says, I'm telling you, one stone will not be left on top of another. So he's saying like this is all going to go to pot, right? And then
mhm,
starting picking up in verse 3, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Well, tell us, when will these things be?" Question one, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? Question two. And so it seems like he's being asked two things. So he starts off answering the first question. Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray." And he keeps going on. He says, I mean, and even in verse 6, he says, "But the end is not yet." And so he goes on, continuing to explain that. We finally get to verse 13, where he says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And so it seems like here he's making a transition into discussing the end. And so then he gives prophecies about the end, let no one who's on the housetop go down and take over his house, and all the stuff that's going on. We see some very clear apocalyptic language that shows up elsewhere in Matthew 29, or I'm sorry, Matthew this chapter, verse 29. The sun will be darkened, and it will not give its light, and stars will fall from heaven. And that sort of apocalyptic language is usually used as like an end times type language. They use it as the apocalypse, the end of everything. And so it seems like that's the topic that he's now moved on to. And then you get down to the verse and the difficult verse, I guess, in verse 33, where he says, so also when you see all these things, then you will know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, my words will never pass away. But concerning that day, the second question, an hour no one knows, and not even the angels of heaven. And part of the reason why I think that this interpretation is more plausible is even if you look back at your quote from C.S. Lewis, there seems to be a dissonance there that isn't addressed. Namely, I mean, even, it's hard to say. He's saying definitely this is when it's going to happen. And also, I have no idea when it's going to happen. So, I mean, if he's talking about one event, that he's saying very specifically describing exactly when it's going to happen, but then also saying, I have no idea when it's going to happen. So it seems like to put both of those in the mouth of the same person about the same topic, it seems contradictory. And so unless you think Jesus is really just directly contradicting himself in an incoherent way, which doesn't make sense to me, it seems like it's more plausible to interpret the passage in the less incoherent way and to say that, well, he's talking about two things. And one thing, he's given specific prophecies. This is exactly when it's going to happen. You'll see these things happening, and then that's when you know. And then the second one, he's saying, well, I don't know when that's going to happen. So what would be wrong with that interpretation? To say he's asked two questions, so he gives two answers.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, so like basically the first half of the chapter up until verse 34, 35, where he talks about after he talks about this generation will not pass, everything prior to that is destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and everything after that is sort of the apocalyptic end of the age. Is that right?
Yeah, it seems to me that the first half of his response up to verse 16 is answering the first question. Well, these sign of these things, that is the temple being destroyed, the stones not being on each other. That the up to 16 is, or I'm sorry, up to 14 is answering that first question, and then he goes on to the second question, which he continues on up until verse 31, and then he reminds him of the fig tree, and then makes kind of general statements about kind of responding to both. First saying, you'll know that he's there. You'll know that he's near at the very gates, which again is a temporal location. Right? Saying, then when you see these things, then you'll know.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says also, that concerning that day, no one knows.
Right. So just a clarifying question to make sure I'm understanding you right too. So when we get to the part about the coming of the Son of Man, and it talks about the angels in the clouds of, the angels coming with him and gathering the elect. I've heard some people suggest that the angels there are referring to like evangelists, preachers, and people going out to preach the gospel to sort of gather the elect in that sense. Is that the view that you take?
No, no, I think that is. I
Okay.
think that verse 29 through 31. I think that is continuing and answering the second question, namely the end of the age and the end of. I mean, yeah, I guess it could be.
I
It
see.
could be messengers. I don't know. It could be preachers, but I think that if it were preachers, then it would still be preachers at the apocalypse, not preachers. Because again, in this part of the passage, it seems to me that he's answering the second question, namely. So I think that you know so he answers from verse 4 to 14. He answers the first question.
Hmm.
15 to um, 31, he answers the second question. And then moving on to verse 33 and 34, he gives a timing of the first question. And then in verse 36, he gives a timing of the second question. So he just explains what's going to happen with the first question. And then he explains what's going to happen with the second. And then he gives the timing of the first. And then he gives the timing of the second.
Hmm. That's interesting. I guess my initial thing there would be when I kind of compare that view and look at Luke 21. I don't know if you see the same, if you would take the same sort of view when you try to compare it to Luke 21, but we do notice that in Matthew's version and in Mark's version, they when they talk about the sign that they will see, they talk about Jerusalem, or sorry, about the abomination of desolation. That's the thing that you will see, and Luke translates that and says that when you shall see Jerusalem compassed about with armies, then you will know that desolation is nigh, and uh, and forgive me because this is the interpretation that you're coming with is one that I haven't heard of before. I've heard of variations of it here and there, but not as complex as this one. So
Sure,
I, w-
yeah, and I would say
I
that Luke 21 is not the proper context for Matthew 24, right? Because Matthew 23 and 25 are the proper context for Matthew 24, and so we can't say just because they use some of the same language they're talking about the same thing. I'd have to go back and read Luke 21 again. I don't remember the chapter offhand.
sure. Yeah,
But
yeah. Luke,
so
yeah, Luke 21 though is the same event. So we're still in the same instance, right? This is still Olivet discourse. And you see Luke and the verse that I'm referring to. It's at the exact moment where Matthew and Mark talk about the abomination of desolation. Luke translates that almost, and he interprets it and decodes it for us, and says instead of he saying when you shall see the abomination of desolation, he says when you will see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, right? Then you will know that the desolation is nigh. So he's translating that for us. And so it seems to me that when I read that, if Luke 21 verse 20, when it speaks about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, if that's the decoding of what's being said in Matthew and in Mark about this abomination of desolation, which I assume you would probably put towards the end, right, towards the apocalyptic end. Luke,
I think that the abomination that makes desolate is a reference to two people. First, it's
okay,
a reference to oh, I can't remember the guy's name. Might have been Nero.
Antiochus. Oh, sorry.
No,
Okay, go ahead.
Antiochus was 26 BC, wasn't it?
Yes. Well,
No, there
yeah.
was a.
Mhm.
So he went in Antiochus, or no, I'm thinking Octavian. Octavian was BC. They got such weird names. Why didn't they go with Fred and Ralph? Um,
Yeah.
I can't remember which one is which, but someone around 65 to 70 AD, there was a Roman general or whatever. He went into the Jewish temple and committed a sacrilege there, and that's the
Mm,
abomination. That's the abomination that makes desolate. And I have not spent a lot of time studying end times prophecy, but a lot of people say that
sure.
that's a prefiguring of um, the man of lawlessness who's supposed to come in the end times, the Antichrist, who
Hmm.
will
Hmm.
be the big capital, capital A, capital D abomination that makes desolate, and so that he's sort of a prefiguring. So there would be two. There'd be like a small abomination that makes desolate, and then the big one at the end. And you see that kind of prophecy a lot in the Old Testament, where for example, they say to Isaiah, that there'll be this son, and that'll be a prophecy of the end times. And then Isaiah has a son, but that's a picture of the son who's also coming. And so it'll be kind of a two uh, a short term fulfillment and then a long term fulfillment of the same prophecy. Um,
Mm,
but
okay.
at any rate, I mean, I haven't read. I'd have to go back and read through Luke 21, but it sounds like what you're telling me is that what I've offered, it seems like a plausible reading of Matthew 24. You just don't think that that there's less wiggle room, I guess, or that may not apply in Luke 21, but at least in Matthew 24, it seems like that does seem to diffuse the alleged false prophecy.
Well, yeah, I would say that I think that because I think that Luke 21 and Matthew 24 are describing the same Olivet discourse. I think that whatever problem that you're trying to solve in Matthew 24, if it's not solved in Luke 21, I would say that would still be an issue. However, I'm
Wouldn't be
I'm also
that'd be an
I
issue in
guess
Luke 21 though, right? That wouldn't be an issue in Matthew 24. It would be an issue in Luke 21.
it would be, as far as I'm concerned, it would be an internal issue in terms of if you believe, as a Christian, for example, if you believe that, these scriptures are, inspired, and you believe that that this is an event that actually happened. Jesus did say these things. You know, I think that whatever Luke's understanding of this idea is, and these sequence of events, if Matthew 24 and Luke 21 are both describing these same events, then sure, yeah. I mean, I'll say this: if we're putting aside Christianity and we're just looking at the text and just saying, okay, like, does what does Matthew's gospel say? What does Luke's gospel say? I would need to know a little bit more about your views on Matthew 24 to decide whether or not this is this wouldn't be a failed prediction, because it sounded like you were saying, and I don't want to take up all your time here, but I don't see any other hands here, so so I'll keep going with it.
Sure, sure. No, you're
It
good.
sounded like you were saying the first question in terms of the first question the disciples ask is, when will these things be, right? And you're saying that question is answered up until verse 14, where it says, and then the end shall come,
Yeah,
correct?
and so like, what's these
Okay.
things? And that's what Jesus just said. So Jesus just said,
Right.
because they're walking into Jerusalem, and the disciples say to Jesus, "Look at all these beautiful buildings. Isn't this amazing?" And Jesus says, "Well,
Hmm.
I'll tell you the truth. Not one stone will be left on top of another." And they're like, "What?" And so they go to him and say, like,
Yeah.
okay, well, when will these things happen? And so I think that these things, that's referring to um, what he just said. That is that, when was it going to be that one stone's not left on the other? And then the second part is, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? And
Hmm.
so, it seems like there are two questions there that he's responding to, or at least two different events that he's responding to. And so, yeah, it
And so
seems like
the
he's giving both different answers.
right, and so I want to be clear on where you're saying that transition is happening. So we're up to the part in verse 15 where it talks about the abomination of desolation. You believe that can be understood about two people, one
No,
around 70 CE, and then one
not
or
in Matthew
two
24.
figures. Oh, okay,
No,
okay.
no, no.
What,
Yeah, Matthew
what were you speaking of?
24, I think 15 through. I think that other passages talk about an abomination that makes desolate, and
Mm,
that is
okay.
earlier. But no, in terms of this passage, I think that from 15 to 31, he's talking about what will be. He's answering what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age, and so that's talking about when will the end come. And so the abomination that makes
And you're
desolate
when
there is not a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay. And so when you say then the end will come, when you're referring to the end, are you understanding that to be the actual apocalyptic end?
Yeah, I
When
think
you say
that
that, so
you're talking about verse
verse
14.
15 through verse 15 through, you said the verse 15 through, I forget where you ended it, but you said that essentially he's answering the question of what will the sign be,
Yeah,
right,
so
of the coming and of the end of the age.
I think he's transferring between topics at verse 14. So verse 14 reads,
Mm,
"And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." And then I think that, and
yeah.
then the end will come. That's when he's transitioning into answering the second question, which is, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And so I think that marks his transition to his discussion of when the end will come, or like what's going to happen around the end coming. And so I think verse 15 through 31 is discussing that question. He's answering that question. Okay, well, what's going to happen around the end? And then verse 32, he goes back and gives a lesson about the fig tree, which, for everybody in the audience, there was a tree and they had an interaction about it. So he basically gives an example from it, and then he gives two more comments about to both questions.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I need to spend more time with that, because that is not something that I've heard before. So I would love that particular interpretation. Um,
Okay. Well, if you
it
want to give,
definitely,
since we don't have anybody else in the queue and we're getting
sure.
last 15 minutes or so, if you want to kind of give like a closing statement, or if you have any content channels that you have, blog, video, whatever, to let us know about, and then we'll go ahead and close it out.
Yeah, I don't have any particular things to sort of promote here, but yeah, I just want to say thank you for everybody's time, and I genuinely appreciate everybody's questions, and thoughts. I think that a lot of great points and a lot of great questions were brought up, and yeah, I mean, I can only end by saying I think my personal view on this still remains that I do think that the Gospels do predict, or the Gospel writers do predict that there would be a second coming within the lifetime of the apostles that did not take place, and I was able to show that effectively. And if you disagree, I would still love to hear more in the channels following this. So yeah, thank you, and thanks, Matt.
All right. Well, thank you, J Buff. I really appreciate being here. And from previous interactions, you definitely seem like a genuine and humble person. So we all, appreciate all your interactions and contributions to the server. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Absolutely.
And yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you next time.